Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. So how do you budget and spend money in your family? Do you live within your means, carefully planning a budget and each and every purchase? Or do you live on debt, a line of credit perhaps, or credit card debt? Or are you somewhere in between? Sadly, the province of Ontario appears to be in a holding pattern of bad budgeting, bad spending, and increasing debt. And just how much debt are we talking? Well, Ontario's debt now exceeds $400 billion, making it the highest sub-sovereign debtor. But how did this all happen? When did things get so out of control in Ontario that we now burden generations to come with our debt? And most importantly, how do we get out of it? Well, joining me now to shed some light on the political and fiscal issues at the Ontario Legislature is Jay Goldberg, Interim Ontario Director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and David Clement, North American Affairs Manager with the Consumer Choice Centre. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. Always an exciting day to talk about debt. I live in Ontario, so this directly impacts me. And I'd like to learn what the plan is to get us out of this debt. So this might be a very pie-in-the-sky discussion, but we have to seriously have this discussion. So we'll start with you, Jay. $400 billion. Is that true? Are we really at $400 billion in debt?
We are, and actually the number is a lot closer to $430 billion. And this number had just grown exponentially in recent years. And actually, I was preparing a pre-budget submission for the Minister of Finance ahead of the budget. We haven't balanced our budget here in Ontario since 2005. That's before the very first iPhone was released. So that's how long ago it was. And at that time, the debt in this province was only $155 billion. So in a very short period of time, the McGuinty, Wynne, and now Ford governments have gotten us all the way to well over $400 billion. And as you said, we're the most indebted subnational unit in the entire world.
Yeah, this is utterly shocking. You mentioned 2005. I mean, I wasn't even married. I have 5 kids now. I had none of them then. That's a long time ago. And to grow a debt to that degree in such a short period of time is shocking. And maybe I'll ask you this, David. What types of programs contributed to this rising debt?
I mean, I think for the most part, it's just an increase in spending across the board with no real plan in regards to generating economic growth to help pay for it or to increase taxes to help pay for it. There are 2 ways in which the government generates or can generate revenue. It can generate it off of increasing taxes. I would highly suggest, or I would be, I think that Jay and I would probably both be pretty hesitant to that idea. But there is a way to generate tax revenue by stimulating economic growth and then obviously generating revenue off the back of that growth. Unfortunately, in Ontario, we haven't really had that.
Right.
We haven't seen Ontario kind of become the economic engine that it once was. And although the Ford government has said open for business, that really hasn't translated in terms of concrete policy yet. Will it happen before the election? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I'm with you. I don't like slogans and gimmicks. I like to see real results. And I recall, as a young woman in the early 2000s in Toronto, we knew Toronto was this, or not Toronto, Ontario rather, that Ontario was this economic engine for the country. And there was a lot of complaining that we gave more than we received back in terms of transfer payments. Yeah, I don't think we're in that position any longer. And I see that there's no real attempt to get us out of there. And I know people say, oh, COVID. But like many other things, COVID simply shone a spotlight on problems. It didn't necessarily create the problem, may have exacerbated it, but we still were in bad shape. 40 seconds to commercial, Jay. What other programs do you think contributed to this huge debt load?
Well, actually, one of the biggest things is just salaries for government employees. Half of the budget in Ontario pre-COVID had to do with salaries for government employees, and they were going up at exponential rates. The number of people on the Sunshine List has increased dramatically. And so if you ever want to actually tackle our fiscal problems here in the province, one of the things you have to look at is all of those government salaries.
Okay, we got to pause for commercial. I want to unpack that just a little bit further after this break. Stick around. Welcome back. We're discussing Ontario's spiraling out of control debt problem. And joining me for that crazy discussion, because it is crazy that we have to have these kinds of discussions. You know, I'm a mother, I have a family, I balance my budget. Why can't the government? Anyhow, joining me for that discussion is Jay Goldberg, interim director for Ontario with Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and David Clement, North American Affairs Manager with the Consumer Choice Centre. Jay, before we went to break, you suggested one way to tackle the out of control debt problem is to rein in, I guess, salaries for employees. So you mentioned and referenced something called the Sunshine List. I know what that is. Some of our viewers may not. Can you explain what the Sunshine List is?
So that's a list, thanks to Mike Harris, that is put out every year that shows Ontario taxpayers exactly who is making more than $100,000 that works for the government. And this list has grown exponentially. We actually have the average teacher in the province of Ontario, and let me say teachers are very important. I have some in my family, but the average teacher in Ontario is making nearly $100,000. And so as we continue to confront this massive deficit, we really have to think about how we're going to deal with that. The Ford government has introduced legislation that puts a 1% growth cap on government salaries, but frankly, it's not enough where we are today. And we need to start talking at the very least about freezes and potentially more going forward.
Sure, but some might suggest, and David, I'll let you jump in here, that, well, if somebody's worked for 30 plus years with the government, that naturally their salary will just keep increasing, and eventually, yes, they'll hit up to that 100,000 mark. You know, I'm still shocked that there are that many government employees making that much money, but, you know, and some will say, oh, well, you have to be competitive to get the right talent. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree that you have to be competitive to get the right talent, but at the end of the day, the salary is not supposed to be indicative of how many years you've served. It's supposed to be indicative of the value that you provide for taxpayers. And so if you've spent, I will make up a government job of digging holes alongside the road, or pick something that is not necessarily as advanced. Your time served does not necessarily mean that you've created more value for taxpayers over time. So I think that's something that's that is often missed in the conversation about government salary. But I think there's a way out of this, which is attrition, so allowing for people to retire, leaning on digitization, especially in the healthcare sector. So using, which may sound scary to some listeners, but AI functionality for even just the most basic intake functions in our healthcare system, which research shows that consumers and patients are becoming actually more comfortable doing, eliminates the need to hire new people to fill those roles where folks have retired. And so that's a way you do so without mass firing everyone, or wide-scale layoffs, which would be politically disadvantageous. But it's a way of creating a more dynamic, in this instance, healthcare system, saving taxpayers money, and ultimately giving patients in the province a more dynamic healthcare system, which improves outcomes.
Now, I think it's an important, I'll let you jump in there in a moment, Jay, but I think that's important that you kind of delineated that this is through attrition. So through folks retiring. So you're not firing anyone, you're not laying people off, but through attrition, you just don't refill those positions because you may have found more efficiencies or a way to do it better since maybe the 40 years since that person started at that job. Jay, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, the Harper government was actually quite successful in trying to decrease the amount of government workers at the federal level. through that very attrition process. But I should also say that there are studies that show that there's a 10% wage gap between the public sector and the private sector, that a comparable job in the public sector working for government gets 10% more in salary than those in the private sector do. So it's not just a question of, paying people, for their whatever position they're in. This is actually proof that you're paying people more for a comparable position in the private sector, which is not something we can have or afford or sustain as a people in Ontario.
Now, Jay, is that, we only have 30 seconds left. Is that common in many jurisdictions in the world, or is this an Ontario, Canada specific problem?
It's somewhat common, but Ontario is one of the highest gap provinces in the country when it comes to that. We have some of the highest paid government employees in the country. Our Sunshine List is by far the biggest in the country, and so action definitely has to be taken.
Okay, we got to cut to commercial. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're trying to unpack the problem of Ontario's spiraling out of control debt. And joining me is Jay Goldberg and David Clement. And I'll let either of you gentlemen jump in here. But I recall, because I was a leadership candidate for the Ontario PCs a few years ago, that one of the big contributors to the debt was the green energy scam, in which we were producing and paying for energy, green energy was called, energy, that we didn't use, that we then sold and turned around, sold it as a loss to Americans and others just to get it off our grid. That to me was such a cash grab. And it really, and that was of course started in about 2008, 2009 after the financial crisis. That was a huge problem. Are we anywhere near clearing that mess? Has the Ford government made any attempts to clear that mess? Either of you want to tackle that?
I was just going to say what the Ford government has done. They've made a decision. Obviously, they've repealed the Green Energy Act. They've also made a decision to essentially subsidize the hydro bills that we all pay. Our hydro bills are a bit lower, and that's not because of some, great improvement in our hydro system here in Ontario. It's because the government is subsidizing our bills. And so when people are paying their hydro, it may seem like a good thing, but actually, we're just the ones subsidizing our own bills because it's the taxpayers who are sending money to Queen's Park, and then Queen's Park is turning around and spending billions of dollars to help lower our hydro bills. So I think we need to realize, first of all, our hydro bills are still some of the highest in North America. But second, we need to understand that the Ford government has moved to spend well over $10 billion just subsidizing hydro bills over a period of several years. They may have been in a very tough spot because of, the disaster we saw in the McGuinty and Wynne eras.
Sure.
But I think people should be aware that we're spending billions of dollars on that. So it's not a real solution.
Yeah, no, it's not a solution to take your money just to give it back to you. I don't need that middleman. I don't need to pay someone to take my money away from me and then hand it back to me. Why don't you just not touch it to begin with? Did I take that out of your mouth, David?
No, that's a very good point. But I think the conversation needs to be had is if the government is going to spend whatever the price tag is, why are we not having another look at expanding nuclear energy? You could make an argument that we don't have the money to spend, and I think that could be a very valid argument. But if the government is going to spend money to try and ensure that we have high quality, consistent green energy, nuclear is, in my mind, the top option. Now, it can be expensive. It is infrastructure heavy. But the longevity of a project like that is something that, and this is very fitting in the context of taxes and debt, right? We're talking about our kids and our kids' kids and what are they going to pay? Mm-hmm. That could be one of the very few moments where something today has that longevity and those lasting benefits for future generations in a way that is consistent, provides energy on demand in a way in which consumers and Ontarians need and want, and does so in a way that is not increasing our emissions. So I would have loved to have seen that as a priority rather than weird shell game of, hey, we're going to tax you and then subsidize your own gas bill. I would have loved to see some sort of pivot to focus on nuclear, but we have not seen that in any wide scale kind of form.
Well, if only politicians would focus on the long-term solutions than the short-term gain, I think we would be in a much better debt situation. But speaking, you brought up a very good point. We're talking about high energy costs, and we do have high energy costs in Ontario. And we're talking about building our economy, stimulating our economy, attracting foreign investment, attracting manufacturing. You can't do that if you have crippling energy costs. Jay, I don't know if you have these stats on hand, or what have you seen in terms of a trend, in terms of manufacturing businesses saying, you know what, we don't want to come to Ontario. It costs too much with your energy.
Yeah, we've seen a huge decrease in manufacturing jobs here in Ontario for well over a decade. It definitely started under Kathleen Wynne-McGuinty because we had such an uncompetitive environment. And now the Ford government is actually dealing with a federal challenge, which is the carbon tax, which is 8.8 cents a liter for gasoline right now. It's going to keep going up all the way until 2030, and it's going to have your energy prices soar. But we need to keep in mind that everything, all of our energy costs involve pretty well oil and natural gas.
Right.
All of our transportation costs to get goods anywhere involves filling up the truck to pay to get the truck somewhere with our goods.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there. We've got to cut to commercial. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Jay, just before we went to commercial, you were touching upon how our burdening, heavy cost of energy here in Ontario is really detracting not just Ontario's, or not just harming Ontarians, but it's actually causing issues with attracting investors and manufacturing in Ontario. Please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have an 8.8 cents a liter carbon tax right now. When you're manufacturing goods, when you're transporting goods, that adds to the cost. The Ford Progressive Conservatives actually promised to lower the corporate tax in the last election. They haven't done that. We've also got really high energy costs in this province because of the legacy of the Green Energy Act. Some action has been taken, but we still have really high hydro costs, some of the highest in North America. And so businesses are facing very strong headwinds, and the government needs to take action to try to make this a more competitive place. The Ford government, they did repeal cap and trade, but then, of course, the federal government has imposed the carbon tax. But the Ford government definitely needs to do more in keeping their promises when it comes to making Ontario a more attractive place to do business.
So, Jay, if there was a manufacturing who's looking to set up shop, they're looking at Michigan, Ohio, Ontario, where are they going?
Well, definitely Michigan or Ohio. You've got lower personal income taxes, lower corporate taxes, lower energy costs, and no carbon tax. So it's a no-brainer really for these companies, and we have to change that dynamic.
Okay, David, I remember a few years ago in the last election, we were supposed to see all this change. There was supposed to be a big tackling of the debt, that we were going to be open for business, as you mentioned earlier, and attracting. Is there really not much difference with Kathleen Wynne and Doug Ford in the last few years? We're almost at another election. So what's gone on?
Yeah, the cynic in me, which is quite depressing, feels like the reality of politics set in. People were very unhappy with the Wynne government. I don't think it really mattered who was the leader of the Conservatives. They likely would have won against Kathleen Wynne because she was so unpopular at the time. And now the reality of politics has set in, and re-election becomes the primary motivator behind core decision-making. And when you do that, you throw a lot of your lofty ideas and your ambitious plans and those long-term issues, long-term and systemic issues that need to be dealt with, those get kind of cast aside for whatever is going to win the day and capture as much interest and vote share as possible as we kind of lead up to an upcoming provincial election. And so it's problematic to see that, because we're not talking about lofty goals that were just lofty for the sake of being lofty. We're talking about ambitious plans to deal with systemic issues like long-term debt and our debt financing issues. And so, I mean, the question remains, the question remains, how long can you kick the can down the road before we get into some serious trouble? And my fear here is that we're going to find out.
Well, and Jay, that maybe this will be my final question to you. We only have about a minute left. You know, we're at 400 billion, apparently 430 billion. For how long can Ontario continue? Do we just have a unlimited line of credit? Will our bond rating eventually go down? What do we expect? 50 seconds.
We can expect definitely ratings going down. We're spending over $1 billion a month right now on debt interest. That's more than we spend on post-secondary education as a province. And so as that goes up, we can afford fewer and fewer government services, and we might have to raise taxes to get there. In Saskatchewan, they were facing a very serious budget challenge in the 1990s, and an NDP government had to close down 52 hospitals. So we don't want to see something like that happen in Ontario. And if we don't, we need to make sure that the government starts to get our finances in order, because even if we can continue to borrow money, if we're spending billions of dollars a month on debt interest, that crowds out a lot of other things that we simply can't spend money on.
Right. Well, Jay, David, thank you for joining me for this very depressing discussion, but a real one, and we have to have it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was indeed a very depressing and a cynical discussion, but we had to have it because we know that we are burdening generations and generations to come with this now $430 billion debt that we carry in Ontario. And it cannot continue like this. It has to stop, and we have to have solutions. We have an upcoming election. Let's see what's going to be promised then. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.